Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's program on democracy, voting, and elections with Rick Hasen, Rick Clarke, and our moderator tonight, Adam Winkler. Before we get started, I want to remind you to please silence your cell phones, and we are videotaping tonight's program, but we ask that you please don't take photographs and videotape yourselves in the space. I also want to just really quickly mention some upcoming programs that you might all be interested in. First of all, we have something here we call Constitution Happy Hour, which is sort of like a book club with a bar, and we read the Constitution together. Everybody who comes gets a free copy of the Constitution, but you have to buy your own beer. And we have amazing constitutional scholars who come, and they'll help us read specific passages or concepts in the Constitution. I think that two of our speakers tonight have actually participated in Constitution Happy Hour as well. Anyway, it's really fun. The next one is on March 26th. We're doing about one a month, and you're all invited. We also are going to have a Super Tuesday watching party on March 3rd, so you can come to the Hammer and watch the results come in from all of the states voting in Super Tuesday primaries. You can also come to the Hammer Museum and vote. We are a voting center. So our voting booths, or the state of California voting booths, are open February 29th, March 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. So for 4 days, we are a voting center, including on Super Tuesday. So come vote, and then you can watch the results here as well. So on to tonight's program. In tonight's conversation, we're going to talk about voting. So democracy is a system of government where citizens exercise power by voting. And according to one of our speakers tonight, Rick Hasen, a good election ensures that all eligible voters, and only eligible voters, can easily cast a ballot, and that that ballot will be fairly and accurately recorded. Simple, right? Pretty straightforward. That's how you have a democracy. What could go wrong? Well, that's what we're going to hear about tonight, all the things that can go wrong. So I'm going to briefly introduce our guest speakers, and then they'll get to it. Rick Hasen is the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at UC Irvine. He's a nationally recognized expert in election law and campaign finance regulation, writing as well in the areas of legislation and statutory interpretation, remedies, and torts. He's co-author of leading casebooks in election laws and remedies. From 2001 to 2010, he served with Dan Lowenstein as founding co-editor of the quarterly peer-reviewed publication Election Law Journal. He's the author of over 100 articles on election law issues published in numerous journals, including the Harvard Law Review, Stanford Law Review, and Supreme Court Review. Hasen's op-eds and commentaries have appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, and Slate. He also writes the often quoted election law blog, and he's written several books, including the 2018 book, The Justice of Contradictions, Antonin Scalia and the Politics of Disruption, as well as the 2016 book, Plutocrats United. His newest book is Election Meltdown, Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threat to American Democracy, which was published by Yale University Press just 3 weeks ago on February 4th, just one day after the disastrous Iowa caucus on February 3rd. Talk about timing. It's almost like he planned it. So in his new book, Hasen describes the 4 factors that pose the most serious threats to the integrity of the 2020 U.S. presidential election: voter suppression, incompetence in election administration, misinformation campaigns, and inflammatory rhetoric undermining faith in the integrity of elections. And these are all things that we're going to be discussing this evening. Kristen Clarke is the president and executive director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, which is one of the country's most important national civil rights organizations in the pursuit of equal justice for all. The Lawyers Committee seeks to promote voting rights, economic justice, fair housing and community development, equal education opportunity, criminal justice, judicial diversity, and more. Throughout her career, Ms. Clarke has focused on work that seeks to strengthen our democracy by combating discrimination faced by African Americans and other marginalized communities. She formerly served as the head of the Civil Rights Bureau for the New York State Attorney General's office, where she led broad civil rights enforcement on matters including criminal justice issues, education and housing, discrimination, fair lending, barriers to reentry, voting rights, immigrants' rights, gender inequality, disability rights, reproductive access, and LGBT issues, and the school-to-prison pipeline. She also spent several years at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, where she helped lead the organization's work in the areas of voting rights and election law across the country. She worked on cases defending the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act and also testified before Congress and state legislatures. Before that, she served as a federal prosecutor in the U.S. Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division and also worked on voting rights and redistricting cases through the division's voting section. She speaks and writes regularly on issues concerning race, law, and justice, and has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, Democracy Now!, Fox News, and C-SPAN. And she's also written numerous articles and books, including Barack Obama and African American Empowerment, The Rise of Black America's New Leadership, co-edited with Dr. Manning Marable. Her innumerable honors and awards include the 2018 Lewis L. Redding Lifetime Achievement Award, the 2018 Harvard College Service to Society Award, the 2017 Thurgood Marshall Award from the Quinnipiac University School of Law, the 2014 New York State Senate Proclamation for Exemplary Service, and the 2012 Supreme Court Best Brief Award from the National Association of Attorneys General. Let's just say that Kristen Clarke is at the forefront of the 21st century civil rights movement. And on a personal note, she's also one of my all-time sheroes. And I'm really honored that she came all the way here from Washington, D.C. for one day just to participate on this panel, because these issues are so urgent. She's fantastic. You'll see in a minute. Our moderator tonight is UCLA law professor Adam Winkler. He's a specialist in constitutional law, the Supreme Court, and gun policy. His 2018 book, We the Corporations, How American Businesses Won Their Civil Rights, received the Scribes Book Award and was a finalist for the National Book Award, and as well as the National Book Critics Circle Award, the ABA Legal Gavel Award, and the California Book Award. He's also the author of Gunfight, The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America, which didn't win any awards, but which was once the subject of a question on Jeopardy. So I think he won anyway. He's one of the 20 most cited active law professors in judicial opinions, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Review of Books, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Slate, and the New Republic. So please, without further ado, join me in welcoming Rick Hasen, Kristen Clarke, and Adam Winkler.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming out here and to the Hammer Museum for having us here at this terrific event. I'm Adam Winkler, and it's a real honor to be on this panel, even as a moderator, not only to see friends out in the audience, but to be with Rick Hasen, who is a longtime friend of mine and someone I've long admired, and his excellent new book on election meltdown is really an important and alarming wake-up call to all of us who are worried about the threats to confidence in the American election system. And it's definitely a pleasure to be here with Kristen Clarke, who's really been on the front lines of the battles to protect and preserve the right to vote, and who has been called one of 5 modern-day voting rights heroes everyone should know. So she's got that going for her. So I'm always happy to be here. So Rick, let me start by saying that in your book, you say that 20 years after Bush versus Gore and that election fiasco that was that recount and everything, that we really haven't learned our lesson. What do you mean by that?
Well, first, let me say thank you to the Hammer and to Adam and to Kristen for coming out. This is a topic that's unfortunately very timely. Election Meltdown came out on the day that the Iowa caucus collapsed. And I think that's kind of the answer to the question. We haven't learned our lesson. Here it was 20 years later, and we still can't seem to be able to run a successful election. If you think about what the problems were in Florida back in 2000, there were problems with technology. We still have problems with technology. We have new technology. We have problems with how we cast and count our votes. And here in Los Angeles County, we're using brand new machines. There are already concerns about those new machines. We have problems with partisans running our elections. We have problems with people engaging in dirty tricks. All of the things that seemed to go wrong in Florida in 2000 continue to go wrong in our elections, not in every election, but under enough circumstances where we have a reason to be concerned. The way I like to think about it is, if you're running a nuclear power plant, you would take extraordinary measures to prevent even a very small risk of a catastrophic problem. And now, 20 years after Bush versus Gore, we're in a much worse shape as a country because we're much more polarized, much more divided. And because of this social media revolution, misinformation and problems spread so quickly and people become so angry. We're in a very volatile moment that we really want to do whatever we can to ensure that come 2020 in November, that when all the votes are counted, that the losers actually accept the results of the election. And that's something, we didn't give much thought to even a decade ago. When George W. Bush handed over power to Barack Obama in January 2009, nobody ever thought to themselves, oh, I wonder if Bush is actually going to leave office. I can't tell you how many times I get the question, is Donald Trump going to leave office if he doesn't win the election? And we can talk about that. That's probably the most common question I get these days. It just shows you how, as a country, things have really changed dramatically and for the worse. And that's what I mean that we've not learned our lesson from the last 20 years.
And you say in the book you identify sort of four particular threats to democracy. Could you talk about how what those four threats are? You've sort of summarized some of them, but to highlight exactly what those problems are that we need to be especially worried about coming into this 2020 election.
Sure. And so what I'm trying to do is ask the question, why is trust in American elections declining? There was just an NPR PBS Marist poll that came out a few weeks ago that said that I think it was 41% of the American population does not believe that the 2020 elections will be safe and secure. That's a pretty astounding number of people. People are worried about foreign interference. They're worried about other things. So what contributes to that? And I go through in Election Meltdown the four main reasons I believe that American trust is declining. The first is this cycle of fights over voter suppression and voter fraud. And it's something I actually talked about at the Hammer. It was almost a decade ago. This is not a new fight. But what I talk about in the book is how you have mostly Republican legislatures passing laws that make it harder for people to register and vote in the name of preventing voter fraud. And that finally, over the last few years, we had some court cases and and a commission to investigate the question, is voter fraud a major problem in the United States? And as I detail in great detail in the book, the evidence is that voter fraud is not a major problem in the United States. But this continuing passage of laws that make it harder to register and vote convince both Republicans that Democrats are trying to steal elections by committing vote fraud, and convince Democrats that Republicans are trying to steal the election through voter suppression. So that's the first problem. It's this vicious cycle. The second are pockets of election administrator incompetence. Most people who run elections in most places do a pretty good job. But in some places, there are problems. I detail, for example, Brenda Snipes, who was the Democratic, consistently reelected person running elections in Florida's Broward County. And in one election, she failed to mail out 58,000 absentee ballots to voters in her area that requested them. In another election, she left a medical marijuana off the ballot completely for some voters. And went on and on like this. In the 2018 election, there were three very close statewide races in Florida. The one between Bill Nelson, the incumbent for U.S. Senate, and Rick Scott, who was the governor, came down to this recount, and she did such a terrible job in running that recount that her county missed by 2 minutes the submission of vote totals to the state. So after doing an entire recount, the recount didn't count because they were 2 minutes late. Because they did not know, the worker who worked for Snipes did not know how to operate the website to give the numbers. But then the County Board of Elections determined that the recount was done so poorly that when they had to ultimately report the numbers, they would report the original numbers, not the recounted numbers, which had 2,000 fewer votes, which were never explained. So immediately Donald Trump started attacking Brenda Snipes as not incompetent, which she was, but as actually trying to steal the election. And so I think there are often in Democratic cities, but it's also a Republican problem. There are just more votes in large cities run by Democrats, a kind of a double whammy that voters in places like Detroit or Broward County face. First, they're hit by a problem of incompetence in the way their local administrators run the elections, and then they're accused falsely by Republicans of engaging in fraud. The third problem is the problem of dirty tricks. We have the Russian misinformation, of course, and I give other examples of that, including a 2017 race for the U.S. Senate in Alabama to replace Jeff Sessions' seat, where forces that were supporting Doug Jones, the Democrat in the race, against Roy Moore, the Republican, engaged in Russian-like misinformation tactics to try to suppress the votes of moderate Republicans. Jones had nothing to do with it, but it was an effort funded to try to convince moderate Republicans that they should stay home rather than vote for Roy Moore. And then the fourth problem is one of increasingly incendiary rhetoric. Lots of rhetoric about stolen or rigged elections. I think people throw that terminology around loosely, and it's really problematic because, as I said in my answer to the first question, when the losers don't accept the results of the election as legitimate, you've really lost your very democracy. People have to say, you know what, this was a tough election. I'm willing to take my lumps this time and fight another day. And if people are not going to do that because they think that the election was stolen from them, then the very foundation of our system is under siege.
Kristen, if I can ask you, so one of the things that Rick identifies is the problem of voter suppression. And like I said, you're on the front lines of the wars to fight against efforts to suppress the right to vote. In recent years, we've seen, it seems, a real uptick in efforts to suppress the right to vote. What are we seeing on the ground? How is the right to vote being restricted today?
Yeah. So, yes, thank you to the Hammer Museum. It's great to be here. Incredibly timely and important topic, and a great book, Rick, which really kind of sets the stage. So there are a few factors that kind of brought us here that I think we should acknowledge. One, a devastating decision issued by the Supreme Court in 2013, a case called Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder, that really opened the floodgates to voter suppression all across the country. It is a decision that cut the heart out of the Voting Rights Act and brought to a grinding halt a very important part of that law that required certain states with long histories of voting discrimination to get federal review of new voting changes before they could take effect. And without that kind of roadblock, we're now in a world where we have to mount long, protracted litigation to fight back against a lot of the voter suppression that we're up against. So that's one. Two, we've got a Justice Department that is just out of business in this space, a Justice Department that hasn't brought a single case to affirmatively enforce the Voting Rights Act, leaving all of the work on the shoulders of civil rights organizations that can't really carry the burden on their own. We're trying. Three, a president who, from day one, and Rick talks about this in his book, launched an unprecedented national commission, an election integrity commission that purported to, want to go across the country to study problems of vote fraud. But the real goal of that commission was really to lay the groundwork for voter suppression. And we fought the administration on this, and that commission ultimately was defeated. President Trump quietly had to sign an executive order disbanding the commission. You didn't catch that tweet. Thank you. The other factor I would say is that sadly, voter suppression kind of works. Our elections have become hotly contested. The margins can be razor thin. And so if you can peel off a couple people here, peel off a couple people there, all of a sudden you have a tactic that can prove outcome determinative. So it is a very ugly world that we're operating in right now that has really required us to be on our toes and to be relentless in pushing back against a lot of the bad actors across the country who are hell-bent on silencing people of color and students and low-income communities in particular. So what are we seeing? I'm just going to use Georgia as an example because Georgia, to me, is ground zero when it comes to voter suppression. This is a place where you see voter suppression manifest itself in the ugliest ways imaginable at every level, at the local level, county level, state level. We are dealing with voter suppression in places like Macon-Bibb County, Georgia, a rural community where officials sought to move a polling site from a majority black school to the local sheriff's office. The community immediately opposed this and said, look, people of color are not comfortable going here. You have to move this, and they wouldn't. So we partnered with the community and found a way to beat back this scheme and ultimately got that site moved to a majority black school. Then you've got places like Randolph County, Georgia, where officials all of a sudden said, we're closing down 7 of the 9 polling sites. 7 of 9. Large number of elderly African Americans. There is no way this would not have had a devastating impact on voter access. So what we did is we worked with the churches and the community groups, we mobilized petitions, and then we showed up to the final community vote. And we came in with our court papers in hand and said, if you go forward with this today, we'll see you in court this afternoon. And they voted it down. So that was another victory. And then you've got Brian Kemp, the former Secretary of State. And he was just a bad actor at every level imaginable. Turn the clock back to 2016. There are groups actively working hard to register people to vote, knocking on doors, but their efforts weren't bearing fruit. So they gave us a call, and we went in to investigate to figure out what was going on. And we uncovered this scheme, this exact match scheme. Brian Kemp had quietly adopted a policy unless every letter, every number, every hyphen on a paper registration form matched perfectly what was in the state's database, they just weren't going to process the form. And there were 35,000 forms collecting dust in the Secretary of State's office. So we sued and got an injunction that required Kemp to process those forms. Those are 35,000 people who would have been locked out in the 2016 election season, so an important victory. But then 1 year later, lawmakers said, you know what, we're going to adopt an exact match law. And they did that, and Kemp, even though he knew that this was discriminatory, the data showed that it harmed people of color who had names that tended to be more unique. It harmed women who, married names, maiden names. Kemp decided to enforce a law that he knew was discriminatory, so we had to go and sue again. So almost like a game of whack-a-mole. All of the examples that I just brought up are policy changes and laws that would have been blocked if we had that core provision of the Voting Rights Act in place, that kind of roadblock, that federal review process that would have looked at those laws right at the outset and said, no, this can't go into effect. This is something that would harm voters of color. So it's a really ugly era that we're in right now that requires that we fight tooth and nail, that we be on our toes, that we be relentless, that communities sound an alarm when there's something nefarious that might be afoot. And we've got to really use the courts to the extent we can to try and fight back to preserve access.
Rick, you know, one of the main justifications, as you say in your book, for vote suppression issues or vote suppression laws is the idea that we're combating voter fraud. And especially for a guy who wrote a book called Election Meltdown, I would think maybe you'd be concerned about something like voter fraud, people going and impersonating someone who they're not. We know that President Trump has claimed that there was significant amount of voter fraud in the 2016 presidential election, perhaps explaining, in his view, the popular vote majority that Hillary Clinton got. You've referred to this view shared by President President Trump and the members of this voter commission as being part of the fraudulent fraud squad. Why is that, and why aren't you concerned about efforts to undermine the confidence in elections by people who are impersonating someone who they're not?
Sure, and I should say that that commission, which I'll call the Pence-Kobach Commission, because it was headed by Vice President Pence, who's now been put in charge of the coronavirus, so I'm very relaxed now about that. And Kris Kobach, who I'll talk about in a second, who's Secretary of State of Kansas. When the commissioners were appointed to that commission, the leading members of what I've called the fraudulent fraud squad were appointed to this commission, and I believe it was your organization that tweeted out that they were the 4 horsemen of the voter fraud apocalypse, or voter suppression apocalypse. So for years, we've been hearing on Fox News and elsewhere that voter fraud is a major problem. And the book actually starts out talking about what I consider to be the most important voting rights trial so far of the 21st century. But it's a case that hasn't gotten a lot of attention because it's not a Supreme Court case like Shelby County versus Holder. It was a district court case in Kansas called Fish versus Kobach. And what was going on in that case was that Kansas, under the leadership of Kris Kobach, someone who, very anti-immigrant, very much someone who'd long claimed without evidence that voter fraud was a major problem, he convinced the state legislature to pass what's called a documentary proof of citizenship law. Show me your papers. If you want to vote, if you want to register to vote, you have to produce your naturalization certificate or your birth certificate at the time you register to vote. So if you register online, you're not registered till you go into a county office and show them the original, which lots of people don't have. So about 30,000 people had their names put on a suspense list. This is to, they were not going to be able to register, they were not going to be registered, they were not going to be able to vote until they showed up with this paper. So this was a law that was going to have a real effect on lots of people. And it's a kind of a complicated interplay, the legal question, between federal law and state law over what the requirements can be to register someone to vote. But by the time Fish versus Kobach got to trial in 2018, the question before Kris Kobach, that Kris Kobach had to prove in federal court was, how much non-citizen voter fraud is there? President Trump had famously claimed in 2016 that 3 to 5 million non-citizens had voted in the election, a claim that was supported by only one person that I'm aware of, Kris Kobach. Right? So no evidence for that. So Kris Kobach had been given the power to prosecute voter fraud. He's the only Secretary of State in the country, in the history of the country so far as I know, to be given that power. He prosecuted 9 cases. Only one involved in non-citizen voting, and that was a legal immigrant. He claimed there's a lot of non-citizen voting, and he put on experts, right? So he was running the trial. This was also unusual. Usually if you're the Secretary of State, you let the Attorney General run the trial, but he decided to run the trial. It didn't go that well for him. He was sanctioned twice, once for lying to the ACLU about the contents of a document that he had given to President Trump, which called for making his documentary proof of citizenship law national, or allowed to be national. And the other was for not understanding the basic rules of how to run a trial. So his sanction was he had to have take a continuing legal education class. The class cost $369, and he used a government credit card to pay for it. But during that trial, he put on an expert, a political scientist who used a very questionable study to try and show that voter fraud was a major problem. It was an internet-based study across the country that is useful for some purposes. But basically, 14 people in Kansas out of this whole survey had answered the survey and said they were not citizens. And 4 of them had indicated that they had voted. So he said, oh, okay, 4 out of 14 times the population of Kansas, 32,000 non-citizens. And 200 political scientists signed a letter saying this was bad social science. So the expert came up with a different way, and this is where my book opens. It's with Dale Ho, another voting rights hero, the ACLU's voting rights lawyer, cross-examining this expert. Because what the expert decided to do was to match the names of those 30,000 people on the suspense list and decide if the names sounded foreign enough. He and his graduate assistant, so there were questions about, well, why was this Lopez considered foreign and this one not? And so the question was, Dr. Richmond, if I gave you the name Carlos Murguia, would you code that as foreign or non-foreign? And the expert says, spell it for me, and he spells it. And he says, yeah, I'd code that as foreign, probably. Yeah, are you aware that Carlos Murguia is a judge in this courthouse? And Kris Kobach claimed that the evidence he presented was the tip of the iceberg. And Judge Julie Robinson, fourth-generation Kansan, first African-American woman judge appointed to the federal district court in Kansas, said there is no iceberg, there's only an icicle, and it's made up mostly of administrative error. And so the moment for the people who are claiming that voter fraud is a major problem in this country, the moment for them to come forward with the evidence was in a court of law where it could actually be proven or disproven. And there was the Pence-Kobach Commission, which similarly collapsed. The efforts to try and prove that this is a problem totally collapsed. And I think it should not be in polite company to say, well, it's an open question. And I think that as we go into this election, I'm really urging journalists to not play the kind of both sides card when it comes to this issue, because there really is no proof that voter fraud is a major problem. There are pockets of problems. We had absentee ballot stealing in a North Carolina election, and it benefited a Republican. This was the 2018 election, North Carolina 9th Congressional District. It happens occasionally. Voter ID laws, documentary proof of citizenship laws, they don't stop it. What stops it are prosecutors looking for clearly illegal conduct, like stealing people's ballots or taking them against state law and filling them in. That kind of stuff happens rarely. And it's not the kind of stuff that's addressed by the laws that are at issue in this, in most of this legislation.
And Kristen, let me say, one of the biggest battles going on right now is over sort of the formal inclusion of people into the electoral system. For instance, in Florida, we have the voters passed an initiative providing for the reenfranchisement of people who had lost their right to vote because of a felony conviction. That's been has been subject to a continuing challenge by elected officials, and I believe even in court now too. Can you talk a little bit about that? Particular what's happening in Florida, and in particular how it might have an impact on the coming election. Florida could be one of the swing states in the 2020 presidential campaign.
Yeah, felony disenfranchisement laws are very, very curious. I mean, they emerge in an era where states were actively working to disenfranchise African Americans. And you look back at the legislative history underlying the adoption of these laws, and the racism that informed the adoption of these laws could not be clearer. To me, it is a sad testament to the state of American democracy that these laws live on the books today. Florida is a place where voters sought to cure this. They went to the polls and passed a ballot, Amendment number 4, ballot initiative, Amendment number 4, that would have corrected this injustice. And what did lawmakers do? They worked at every turn to undermine the will of the voters. They adopted a new law that said, people with criminal histories can get placed back on the rolls and have their right to vote restored. But first they've got to pay off their fines and fees. And fines and fees also is another practice that dates back to the Jim Crow era, and today remains a practice that unnecessarily entangles many poor people who are disproportionately black and brown in the criminal justice system merely because of their poverty. There is litigation now unfolding around this, but the one thing that looms heavy is confusion. For a lot of people, they just don't know what the current state of play is, and it's an uphill battle to see whether we can reach the estimated 1.4 million people across Florida who are disproportionately black and brown, who deserve the right to vote. They are American citizens. They paid their debt to society. They are taking care of their families. They are working, paying taxes, and they deserve the right to vote like every other ordinary American. I think about the 2 states in the country that have no such disenfranchisement provision on the books. Rick, correct me if I'm wrong, Vermont and New Hampshire. Maine and New Hampshire.
Maine and Vermont, I think.
Maine and Vermont.
I think.
Well, New England states that are overwhelmingly white, where race is just, you can actually vote while you are in prison, right? You take race completely out of the equation, right? And there's just no debate here. So to me, this is a perplexing issue, one that kind of bears the stain of racism. And, I hope that we can soon get to a place where these laws are eliminated root and branch.
If I could add something, I think it's really interesting about these kinds of fights over Amendment 4, which is this re-enfranchisement provision, or voter ID laws, is that so much of the devil is in the details. So if you want to vote in Florida, if you were a felon, under the rules that the legislature passed that are now subject to litigation being brought by these voting rights groups, you have to sign a piece of paper under the penalty of perjury that you have no fines or fees or court costs against you. So you could go, it's a felony, right? You could go back to jail if you vote if you're wrong, right? And it turns out I have a friend who's a political scientist at the University of Florida named Dan Smith, who's been an expert for the plaintiffs in the case. There's no state repository, there's no database. You can say, okay, I was a felon in 1992. Can you tell me, do I owe money to anybody? The answer is, we can't tell you. You have to go to every court and every county, any place where you were subject to any kind of judicial process and check with them. And so, same thing with voter ID laws. Lots of times when people don't vote in a state with a voter ID law, it's not because they lack the ID, it's because the state hasn't told them that they could vote without the ID, with signing an affidavit, or what kinds of documents are allowed. And so much of what ends up suppressing votes is not the actual legal requirements, but instead the kind of confusion and murkiness that takes place around this. And that stuff often falls through the cracks, but in close elections, those things matter. But even more importantly, if you talk about the dignity of each voter, Florida voters voted 2-1. It was like 67% to pass this, Democrats and Republicans. And here's the legislature coming in and trying to mess it up for political reasons and denying people who paid their price for society their chance to vote again.
Kristen, in one area where there's a lot of concern now is whether we can trust our voting machines and our voting system, whether they're subject to being hacked or whether subject to the incompetent administration of election officials. There was a story out of a recent Georgia election where in one precinct, one voting machine had totally different outcomes than all the other voting machines in that particular district. Are our voting machines safe? Are we voting in an environment where we can trust the tabulation of votes?
Yeah. So this is a messy issue. Let me just share this. So we run at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law a program called Election Protection. It's the nation's largest and longest running nonpartisan voter protection program. It came about in 2001 after the fiasco of Bush v. Gore. We wanted to provide a nonpartisan place where people could report and lodge complaints about breaks in our democracy. And this is often one of the biggest complaints that we hear from voters on Election Day. There are long lines, we have no idea what's going on. They're turning us away, telling us to come back later. And what we have found is that long lines are often attributable to, poll worker incompetency, sadly. I do think it's important that we lift up the important civic duty of poll workers, but sometimes they get it wrong. But often these long lines are attributable to old, malfunctioning voting equipment. We partnered with an organization called the Coalition for Good Governance in Georgia and sued the state over their voting equipment, which was among some of the oldest in the country. The evidence that was uncovered during trial was quite remarkable. One, the state was using software that was about 2 decades old, that was no longer produced by Microsoft. They no longer produced security patches. I mean, it was just stale and old. Two, the state relied on contractors who worked, some of them outside of inside of their garages in their homes in totally unsecured places to build out the electronic ballots. And these machines just broke down routinely. So we sued the state, and we got, for the very first time, a federal court just struck down the entire thing, just said Georgia's voting equipment has to go. And so right now, they are in the process of rolling out new equipment in 2020. There's still some issues that are contested about the new equipment, but this is a really big issue. What makes this even more complicated is this very real threat of Russian interference in our elections. We have a Senate intelligence report that is being ignored that said that this is a real documented threat, a bipartisan produced report that says that Russia was a threat in 2016 and remains a threat now. I am very disheartened that we do not see this Senate doing more work to make sure that states have the resources and support that they need in place to make sure that elections throughout the 2020 season, to make sure that there's security and to make sure that there's public confidence that when we go to the polls and cast a ballot, that it's counted in the way that we intended, that we get that receipt that shows proof that our ballot was treated in the way that we intended it to. So this is a really huge issue that demands more attention.
And Rick, what are the things that we can do to protect our voting system? I'm curious, and also if you could address whether and to what extent some of these problems with our voting mechanisms and our voting system stem from the federalist system that we have, where we have power divided between the state and federal government.
Yeah, let me start with that point because it's kind of a mistake to think of us as having a single election in November. We're actually having something like between 8,000 and 9,000 elections, because that's how many election jurisdictions there are in the United States, usually at the county or the sub-county level. Each county might have different machinery. There's no requirement that across the state that counties use the same machines. You may remember that from Bush versus Gore. You may remember the butterfly ballot, right, which was Palm Beach County. That's the so-called Jews for Buchanan voters who thought they were voting for Al Gore, but were actually voting for Pat Buchanan. So we've had problems with these kinds of systems for a long time, and if we had a national system like they have in Australia, or Canada, or Germany, I mean, pick your modern advanced democracy. They have a national nonpartisan election board running their elections. The machinery is the same everywhere you go when you're voting in a national election. The ballot looks the same format. But we've had over 200 years of history of decentralized, hyper-decentralized elections. And so it's now a problem. And so when, for example, the Russians were able to break into the Illinois voter registration database, they were able to do it with an attack, a phishing attack, sending an email that looks like it's Gmail or looks like it's Dropbox to get somebody in. I think the county had 3 employees. And that's all it took. They were looking for a way in. And so we've now supposedly done a lot more on cybersecurity. We have DHS out there saying that they're working with state and local governments on this. What I'd like at the top would be for the president to say that any attack on American election systems would be considered an attack on the United States and would be responded to accordingly. Unfortunately, not only do we have a president who has not shown leadership in this way, we have a president who has invited foreign interference at least 3 times. Right, Russia in 2016, and now Ukraine and China. So I'm concerned. I think in terms of what we can do, and this is I think a really important point, the one advantage in terms of trying to fix things when it comes to issues of election administration technology is because we're decentralized and because it's on the county level, we all have the power to demand that our local officials are following good practices. So you don't have to go to Washington to try to get good voting machines, although we need to get the money from there. But you can be, going to Dean Logan, who runs our elections here, or Neil Kelly, who runs the elections in Orange County, and ask, what are the things that are going to be done to make sure that the votes are secure and that there are what I think is one of the most important things, post-election audits. If we're going to have machines counting our ballots, and right now, I don't know if any of you have voted in LA County, but when you're voting on the new voting machines, it's going to produce a barcode, and that barcode is what's going, or a QR code, that's what's going to be scanned. Well, we need to know that that QR code, which is supposedly listing your choice for president, actually reflects your choice. And so we're going to have audit mechanisms in place. California is going to have those audit mechanisms in place. I'm a little concerned about how quickly things were rolled out here. But in Georgia, they're fighting. They may say that the barcode controls over the name on the ballot. And so, again, devil's in the details, but it takes local pressure to require transparency and require that local election officials are accountable either to the people or to the elected officials to whom they report.
Kristen, your organization, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, was part of a large sort of coalition of civil rights groups that recently came out with sort of a bold agenda for how to protect and preserve the right to vote going forward. What are some of the key principles you think that we need to think about in terms of reforming our election system so that we can make the vote more reliable and dependable?
Yeah. I think it's important to call out voter suppression because it truly is a grave threat to democracy. But at the same time, we do need to make sure that we're cultivating a narrative of reform, of ways to really modernize and ways to really bring America into the 21st century, ways to kind of bring America, up to par with our counterparts across the world. Democracies of similar size and scope that have higher participation rates and higher turnout rates. There's some reforms that have been proven to yield higher turnout. Same-day voter registration. Minnesota often is number 1, 2, or 3 in terms of voter turnout because that is a state where you can turn out on election day, establish your eligibility, and vote right there.
And now we can in California.
Yeah, amen. Automatic voter registration, right? You go to agencies where you are proffering all kinds of social security cards, proof of address, proof of citizenship. Like, why not automatically add you to the voter registration rolls? More early voting opportunities, right? So that people who can't get out of work on election day, have maximum opportunities to vote. Making election day a holiday, which they're thinking about in Virginia right now. Just this week, the state voted to get rid of their Confederate holidays, which were part of their state holiday slate, and they are, thank God, going to make Election Day a holiday. So there are a lot of good reforms that we need to make sure that we are constantly talking about. The bad actors won't bring them up, but there's some tested and known reforms that can really kind of bring us up, bring us into the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Rick, do you want to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say that I agree with, I think, all of those reforms, but again, the devil's in the details. So in both California and Illinois, they said automatic voter registration, which I think is a great idea, except they said, we're going to have the DMV do it. And having the DMV do anything is never a good idea. And so in California, we had non-citizens who were registered to vote. We had Republicans who were registered as Democrats. We had people who tried to register vote who were not registered because you're asking people at the DMV to register people to vote. And actually, it's even worse in Illinois, where some non-citizens were, against their wishes, registered to vote, and now they're in trouble with the United States Immigration Service because it's a deportable offense to register to vote if you're a non-citizen. And so we have to be careful about how we do these things. And we have to be careful about rolling out our changes and doing it in a way. I'm all for enfranchising as many eligible voters as possible. We have to do it in a sensible way so that we don't have massive administrative problems. And I think that, for example, here in California, it's kind of the opposite of the voter suppression problem. It's that Democrats in the state legislature want to enfranchise as many people as quickly as possible because they think that's going to pad their majorities. And so they rush through automatic voter registration before they ensured that the DMV was actually capable of administering it. So we've got to pay attention to these details.
Okay, enough about the good news. I want to ask about the doomsday scenario. November 3rd, 2020, Election Day. Early returns show that President Trump is going to win re-election. He tweets out that he's won, and we need to beware of that. Democrats committing fraud from here on out. As the night wears on, more votes come in, especially from urban areas. It turns out those are more heavily Democratic. The vote switches, and a Democrat wins. And President Trump says, declares that there's fraud, refuses to concede. Is this some fantastical, never to occur, far-fetched, impossible to imagine scenario?
No. Actually, it happening on election night is possible, but let me explain why this is, I think, actually quite plausible, which is that another reform that's being rolled out in Michigan and Pennsylvania, a reform I like, that's a good thing, as in California, no excuse absentee balloting. So it used to be, if you were in Pennsylvania, for example, there was no early voting. You either showed up on election day in person, unless you had a medical excuse or some valid reason for being out of town, or you didn't vote. Now anybody can get an absentee ballot. Well, as you know from California, and as you may remember from the 2018 congressional races in Orange County, it takes days and days to process those absentee ballots, because you need to check the signatures, you need to make sure everything's in order before those ballots can be taken out and counted. So it's quite possible, number one, that in a state like Pennsylvania or Michigan, Donald Trump is ahead on election night, only to see the numbers change. And number two, we know, as we saw in California, that those late-coming ballots tend Democratic. It's what the social scientists have called the big blue shift, that ballots start off more Republican and become more Democratic because it's not as though people who are Democratic or Republican are voting at the same time. The Democrats are tending to vote later, and so the later counted ballots. We saw this in 2018 in that close race that I mentioned between Rick Scott and Bill Nelson, where Trump actually tweeted, must go with election night totals. Other ballots, quote, massively infected. So, could he do this? Sure. What would that mean, though? Well, I think the first question is, how close is it, and how plausible is the claim that he has to victory? If it's very close, then I think this is a great danger, because he could, for example, if it's Pennsylvania, try to convince the Pennsylvania legislature to send a second slate of electors to the Electoral College, which get considered by Congress. And you would get a headache if I tried to explain to you the complicated rules that apply to figure out what to do in Congress if there are two slates of electors sent to Congress, a Democratic slate and a Republican slate. That would be kind of like a Civil War type, terrible kind of scenario. Right, so that's possible. But if it's not close, then it might be more like the Matt Bevin situation. Matt Bevin was the Kentucky governor. He was an incumbent. He ran against Andy Beshear, who was the son of the former governor, Steve Beshear. And Andy Beshear looked like he was winning on election night. Bevin didn't concede. He said there were irregularities. He said that the state, or his people said that the state constitution gave the Kentucky legislature the power to overturn the election in the event of irregularities. One of the members of the Kentucky legislature said, we'll look into that. There was a lot of outcry from a lot of people, including us. And then eventually the legislators said, Bevin, come up with your evidence or concede. And a week later, he conceded, although he lamented that there was so much, quote, urban vote that occurred in his election. Bevin was not a very well-liked Republican among Republicans in Kentucky. Trump commands much more loyalty, so it's going to have to be a big margin. If it's a close margin, then sure, that could happen. I think it really could happen.
You don't think that we could depend on even members of the Republican Party to come out and say, no, we have to respect the results of the election? I'm trying to get an answer. I mean, come on.
Would you like to feel that one?
We've been doing a lot of this work, just kind of imagining all of the different scenarios that we have to brace for this fall, and none of them are far-fetched. There's some darker scenarios,
Don't go to that place.
What if the military is deployed to kind of seize machines and seize ballots in particular states? What if there's violence in the streets?
A quarantine for coronavirus?
Yeah, the coronavirus. What if the federal government, tells employees don't show up for work, and could that harm the census count that is now underway? Could that harm how elections are run this fall? What if the president orders, we're not going to have elections in particular states because of the coronavirus threat? So we are doing work to just kind of imagine what do we do to fight back. Litigation, I think, will be one tool that we have to use in our arsenal, but we have courts that are becoming increasingly hostile. There is one thing that this administration has done well, and with the full complicity of Senator McConnell, and that is, appoint to the courts at lightning speed extremist judges who come in who are, have no capacity to be independent, are fair, and are there to kind of carry out a particular agenda. They're not normal kinds of nominees that we have ever, seen in the past. So I am gravely concerned, and I think that these are not scenarios that we should laugh at. I think they are absolutely scenarios that we should brace for. And right now we are kind of imagining the range of legal strategies that we might employ if that kind of doomsday scenario unfolds.
Yeah, I'm thinking, imagine that this dispute over who wins Pennsylvania goes to the United States Supreme Court. And this United States Supreme Court on a 5-4 vote with all the Republican-appointed justices siding with Trump and all of the Democratic-appointed justices siding with the Democratic nominee. And the Democrats say that Gorsuch vote, that should have been Merrick Garland's vote. And so that result is illegitimate. And so this would be a situation not where Trump refuses to concede, but where Democrats refuse to accept the results of the election as legitimate. I mean, I think that, or what if there's what's considered by Democrats to be massive voter suppression in Georgia or Florida, and that state is the one that is pivotal to the Electoral College. I mean, there's just a lot of ways that things could go wrong. Now, the good news is the election administrator's prayer is, Lord, let this election not be close. Most elections are not so close that they can be contested. And one of the things that Nancy Pelosi said after Democrats took back the House was she was glad that Democrats took back the House by a lot, because if it were 3 or 4 seats, Trump would have tried to contest it. So if it's not close, we're probably okay. But we need to start thinking now. And actually, I've convened a conference down in Irvine. You can watch the live stream. It's on Friday, called Can American Democracy Survive the 2020 Elections? And the purpose is to come up with specific things that could be done in the next few months to try to minimize the chances of this happening. Like, for example, states should have a plan B. What happens if you have to close the polling places because there's a quarantine or there's a terrorist attack, right? We need to have plans in place. We need to have clear rules. We should clarify the rules for what happens if there's 2 slates of electors going to the Electoral College. There's lots that can be done in the next 8 months. That was my good news.
Okay. Before I jump off the top of this building, I thought maybe we would open it up to questions from the crowd. There was a hand up in the back. Are there microphones for our...
Hi. So I was in New York recently, capital of the world, and they had, I was at a play, and they had an organization out in the foyer who were able to register people, regardless of where they lived, right there and right then. Wondered if you knew anything about that, how it can work, how it's verified, and is it something that can be taken into these areas where there are a lot of problems?
Yeah, you can't register to vote online in a lot of states. I hate when I see that happening. I mean, there are some states like Virginia and others where you can register to vote online, but there are other places where you got to do it the old-fashioned way. So I worry when I see those kinds of efforts that I think are like a false sense of optimism that people have done all they need to do to register. I've seen some places that have done that, and they print out the form and say, okay, now you've got to mail it in. And I don't know whether that step happened there, but it's really important that organizations that are out there purporting to have the capacity to register people in all 50 states, that they're doing it by the book. Our election protection program is anchored by a hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE, 866-OUR-VOTE, and I strongly encourage all of you to share that with your networks, put it out on social media. We got to make sure that people make it onto the rolls at the end of the day.
Yes, over there in the back of there, yeah.
I'm just curious, the kind of more private efforts like Uber or Lyft, I'm not going to say that they have, but I seem to recall that they had volunteered to transport people. Is there any commentary, or can you speak to the importance or the role in kind of the private actor work?
Sure. So you're not allowed to offer incentives for people to vote in a federal election. So you can't say, everybody who comes to vote gets a lottery ticket and someone will win $1 million. You could actually do that in a California state election because that's not a violation of state law if there were no federal candidates on the ballot. Kind of surprising. But on federal law, you can't. The one exception is for transportation to and from the polls. And so it was nice that Uber, I think it was Uber, was offering this in the last election. But they were only offering you a ride to the polls. They were not offering you a ride back. So, they were, I think it was kind of like 50% off. It was a promotion more than it was anything else. There are efforts to get people to the polls. There's lots of that done by parties and by nonpartisan groups. The most important thing is in states with early voting to get people to vote early. And that's important not only for increasing turnout, but also in case there are glitches in terms of how voting goes, you have more than one opportunity to go. So, I don't say vote early and often, but I do say vote early. It's important to get out there. And these efforts tend to be like the free transportation tends to be on election day when things can be kind of hairy.
Where's our microphone?
We have two of them.
We have two microphones? Okay, so in the back here?
Yes, can you speak to the security of absentee ballots and whether or not that would be a viable thing to encourage people who might otherwise be hesitant to vote?
So that's a great question, and I think it's a really difficult question because Californians love their absentee ballots. I think the figure was 63% of Californians in the last election voted by absentee. It's convenient. You could do it from home. You don't have to bother going to the polling place. And now, of course, with our move to vote centers, you're not going to be able to go to your neighborhood polling place anymore to vote in person. You're going to have to go further, although you have more days to do it. But once a ballot is not in the hands of elected officials and is other people's hands, it can get lost, it could get stolen, it could be tampered with. And so it's a trade-off. In some states, vote by mail works very well. Some states have all vote by mail. Colorado, Oregon, Washington. I don't think that model would work everywhere, but it seems to work well there. One of the things that concerns me in California, and this won't earn me any friends from the Democrats in the legislature, is that California passed a law allowing for ballot harvesting. I don't like that term, but it's the idea that you can go around and you can collect absentee ballots from anyone who's a voter. And California Democrats used this aggressively in the last election. That's some attribute part of the victory in those those closely contested Orange County congressional races to these Democratic efforts. But it was that same kind of activity of collecting ballots from strangers, lots and lots of them, that led to the problems in North Carolina. That activity was illegal in North Carolina. You couldn't collect the ballots. They also took the ballots and they tampered with the ballots. But I'm concerned about the security of absentee ballots. I would like people to at least have to have an excuse why they can't mail back their own absentee ballot. So I am concerned somewhat about the security of absentee balloting.
I think no one-size-fits-all approach is what we need in our democracy, and opening up as many avenues as possible for people to exercise their vote is key. There are some states, like Utah, that we had to sue that went to all vote by mail that didn't think about Native American voters who need language assistance, who need to vote in person, and who need assistance in order to cast an effective and meaningful ballot. There is also the very lived and real experience of many Black and brown people in our country who, lived through Jim Crow and know what it feels to be locked out, who it is very important to have that experience of casting that vote and handing it over and knowing that it is counted and not just dropping it in the mail. So in my view, it's all about providing as many opportunities and many different avenues as possible to make sure that you reach everyone in our democracy.
We have a question here in the front.
Thank you. I wanted to see if we had a functioning FEC, could any of these risks be mitigated? And in light of the fact that we have, I think, half empty seats in the FEC, is there a way to compel the Senate or whoever controls the FEC to fully staff it?
So the FEC is the Federal Election Commission, and despite its name, it doesn't really deal with elections. It only deals with campaign financing. It's the United States Election Assistance Commission, which, how many of you have heard of that organization? 3 hands. Okay. It was created in 2002 after the Florida debacle in something called the Help America Vote Act. And its main job was to give out money for states to upgrade their voting machines and to provide for best practices. 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. It started off as an agency that had some promise. I actually tell this story in an earlier book of mine called The Voting Wars. But it was basically Republicans started putting onto that group a kind of partisan hacks. And now it does very little. And for many years, like the FEC, it had no quorum. We need fundamental reform. I think we need a national, nonpartisan election administrative body. That's not what either the EAC or the FEC is. And I don't think there's anything we can do in the short term, certainly not before November, where we're going to have an enhanced federal role. What we need to be thinking about in the next few months is triage. What can we do to make things a little less terrible? That's my goal in the next few months.
We have another question here in the front.
This question is actually for Rick. You mentioned that there are 4 dangers to our society in terms of the elections. I think there's one that's not mentioned. That's a real danger, and it's always going to be an ongoing danger from now, and that's Fox News. And with the constant lies that they push and so on, I'm not sure you have any way of countering that.
So let me make that question a little more general, which is about the role of misinformation in elections, which I do address in the chapter on dirty tricks. I think misinformation is a big problem, whether it's Russian misinformation or misinformation coming from partisan sources. The biggest problem with misinformation is not necessarily that people are going to believe the misinformation, but that they're going to tend to disbelieve true information, that we're going to believe it's going to cheapen everything, and it's going to be hard for us to make decisions, especially now with the rise of social media. You look through your feed in terms of what's on Facebook or Twitter, and you're following people who you politically agree with, and so you are in an echo chamber, and you're hearing more of the same thing. And so it's very hard to get people objective sources of information. And the rise of social media not only has made it cheaper to spread bad information, it's destroyed the business model for local news. And that's one of the reasons why I think we saw that ballot fraud in that North Carolina congressional district where they tampered with the absentee ballots, because there was no local newspaper to investigate. I would say the most important thing is to support reputable local journalism. And that's one of the most important sources. And unfortunately, we're now seeing in places where newspapers have closed, fake local websites that have cropped up that pretend that's like, the Studio City Times, when what it actually is a partisan outfit. And Democrats are now talking about, this was a strategy that some Republican-oriented groups have done. Democrats have now actually started a few of these as well. And I think this is very bad for democracy, to make yourself look like a journalistic outfit but engage in propaganda.
Question here in the black. Wait for your microphone 1 sec. There you go.
Yes, I don't know whether people here are aware. I happened to get a copy of the technical report for the voting machines in Los Angeles. There are 43 violations and 7 absolute fails. The voting machines, the seals can be bypassed, the locks can be bypassed. You can open the machine and take ballots out, put ballots in. If you overvote, the first vote gets dropped without your being notified. The people who did the report said that the machines were very hackable. You cannot, there's supposed to be an audit trail if somebody electronically tries to hack it or tries to enter the machine. That audit trail doesn't work. And it didn't come out. So the bottom line is this was done in December. Obviously, these things aren't going to be fixed for March. What can we do to make sure that those violations are fixed going forward for November?
Well, you know, the thing is, Los Angeles is leaps and bounds ahead of, you know, many parts of the country. And I could be wrong, but I do feel like there are officials in place who are receptive. But it sounds like we need to sound an alarm. And hopefully you have an audience that is responsive and committed to, you know, being held accountable and addressing the breaks that have been identified.
And I know that the state and the county have been negotiating over fixing these problems. For example, they've come up with a temporary solution in terms of the sealing of the ballots. And this is what I mean when I said that we all have a responsibility in our local areas to ensure that there's transparency and there's competency. And so if you're concerned about this, I would urge you to contact your the registrar, contact the Board of Supervisors, contact the Secretary of State's office, and voice your concerns. And the more people that voice their concerns, the more pressure there's going to be to make sure that the flaws in the new system are fixed. And you know, just like you wouldn't, if you wrote a play, you wouldn't want to premiere it on Broadway, right? You'd want to try it out in a smaller venue first. Lower stakes. It's unfortunate that lots of states finally now have got the money and the technology to change their voting equipment to something better, but they're doing it in a very high-pressured environment, and that's problematic because some things are being rushed, and there's a lot of pressure. If something goes wrong, immediately we focus on that problem. We don't focus on the 95% of the places where things went well.
Question, we have a question over here on the right.
Please wait for the microphone.
A lot of these problems seems like they're on the margins when you have 45% of people who do not vote in national elections and even higher that do not vote in local elections. And I'm wondering, is there suppression through apathy and how we deal with that, which is a huge number of voters?
Yeah. Yeah, I do think, and sometimes worry that kind of talking about voter suppression could have this impact, this collateral consequence of discouraging people from participating, breaking their confidence. But on the other hand, I do think that there is this problem of apathy and figuring out how do we activate and reach people who have not engaged. Throwing up barriers and hurdles and strict photo ID requirements and burdensome documentary proof requirements are certainly not the way to reach them. I am heartened by what we've seen in some recent elections, higher levels of participation among young voters in particular. And I also think that there is work that we've got to do to get people to really embrace and recognize the power of their ballot. You know, by way of example, if you're somebody who cares about criminal justice reform, then you should really care about who your elected district attorney is, right? You should care about your elective sheriff running your jail who has the power to set policies on issues like solitary confinement. You should care about your mayor who has the power to decide whether to hold accountable a police officer who uses deadly force without basis. So there is work that I think we can all do to get more people across the country to embrace and recognize the power of the ballot and the fact that that power descends down the ballot. It's not just about going out and electing a president every 4 years. Democracy is kind of manifest, at every level in our country. I'd
add also that, for this coming election, the prognosticators are expecting what they're calling a voter turnout tsunami. We're going to have this huge turnout. And on the one hand, it might overwhelm some of our systems because we're used to low turnout. On the other hand, even the tsunami is lower than that's being forecast, is lower than the turnout in lots of other advanced democracies. So even if we have this huge bump, it's still low compared to other advanced democracies.
We had a question over here.
There's a phrase around connected to the work that you all do called paper ballot. And I never understand what that is, given all the technology that we've discussed tonight. I mean, it sounds like it's a backup. Is there a backup?
So just the term paper ballot means a physical piece of paper that shows you your choices. So there are some voting machines, they're called DREs, electronic voting machines, like an ATM, with no receipt. It's all electronic. They had those in Georgia. So they say, okay, the total is, Smith gets 5 and Jones gets 4. Okay, I want to recount. They push the button again. Smith gets 5, Jones gets 4. How do I know? Well, the machine told me, right? So if you have a piece of paper, you can actually count and see how many votes Smith and Jones got. So almost every jurisdiction is moving towards some physical piece of paper. Even if you're voting electronically, it's going to produce a paper ballot. That's good. I think it's something like 16%. You don't take it with you. If you did, then you could sell your vote. You could say, look, I voted for this person, give me $20. So we don't let people take it, but you can see it. Okay. So I think it's 16% of the American public are going to vote on paperless machines. That's down, way down from where it has been. And hopefully it'll go to 0. The big fight is over whether we should have these machines like they have in the new fight, over whether you have the machines like we're rolling out in Los Angeles now, which are called ballot marking devices, or BMDs. You put it on the touch screen, it spits out a ballot. Or you should have hand-marked paper ballots, like how you take an exam, the DMV or a scan, like on a Scantron with a number 2 pencil. Right, how you fill out an absentee ballot. To me, that's the gold standard. It's old tech, but you can physically recount it, you can look at it. The question about these BMDs, some of the computer scientists feel that they're not auditable enough. I'm not a computer scientist. I can't fully weigh into that. I like the idea that there's a piece of paper, but I think the easiest way is just have people mark. Now, of course, if they have disabilities, there are accommodations for that. But for people who can do it, have them fill out with the number 2 pencil, and then there's a piece of paper that's a hand-marked paper ballot.
There's a question here, in the front row here. So I'm just curious. In every presidential election, we see the situation where in the same state, in one area, you have wait lines that are like 5 hours, and in other parts of that exact same state, people walk in and vote immediately. And I'm just curious how that happens, and if there's laws that are set up to try to prevent that from happening, or what the mechanism of that is.
Yeah, we saw this in Maricopa, Arizona, a few years ago. Long lines, extending for blocks in Arizona. And, they experimented with these mega voting centers. They kind of got rid of local polling sites, and it was just a disaster that they were not prepared for. In places like Georgia, you see these long lines, and it was because their old voting machine was just breaking down, and they were telling people, come back, and people were like, I can't. I've got to go to work. I've got to pick up my kid. This is my window for voting. So I think that there are lots of issues that kind of feed into what produces long lines. There are no federal standards, and so we're doing a lot of work now to try and clean up the landscape in the hopes that we'll see less problems on Election Day.
Just a quick story. After there were problems in 2012, President Obama formed a commission to study how to improve the electoral process. And bipartisan commission, unlike the Pence-Kobach commission with 2 Republicans at the head and no experts. This was Obama's lawyer and Romney's lawyer at the head, 2 very well-respected lawyers. Bipartisan commission. One of the people put on that commission was the head of Disney Parks queue management. And they came up with a set of recommendations that no voter should have to wait more than 30 minutes to cast a ballot. And there are scientists who are studying how you do this. One of the first things the Trump administration did when they came into office was they removed the report that this commission had created. They wiped all of their stuff off. Now, you can find them now because they're posted on MIT's website. But there's a science behind this. If we took the politics out of it, there are ways to shorten lines. And, good voting machines, good queue management, we can solve a lot of these problems. We do a lot more complicated things. We can run a line and give people a chance to vote.
And more polling sites, more early voting opportunities. There was a study recently that looked at cell phone data and kind of tracked how long people seem to be lingering and waiting at polling sites on Election Day. And no doubt there was a pattern that showed it was in majority Black and Latinx communities where people were subjected to far longer lines. It's easy to do the right thing. Just give people, a fair opportunity to vote. Lots of early voting opportunities, voter education, make absentee voting easy. Don't shut down polling sites. Make sure your poll workers are properly trained. Make sure that you're using 21st century voting equipment.
Well, you've heard a number of important suggestions about things you can do to help preserve and protect our election system in this coming 2020 election. Let me suggest 3 more. One, it's important to stay informed, so continue to come to events like this at the Hammer that engage with the political issues of the day. 2, you can support the leading organizations like Kristen Clarke's Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, one of the organizations that really on the front line of protecting and preserving the right to vote. And organizations like that need your support. And then 3rd, perhaps most importantly, is you can go buy Rick Hasen's book, Election Meltdown, which is for sale right in the back of the room, and Rick will be signing copies after this event. I want to thank you two for an absolutely marvelous conversation. And
I just wanted to note as we close that this Sunday actually marks the 55th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. The day in Selma, Alabama, when peaceful demonstrators crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, marching for the right to vote. And crossing that bridge that day, 55 years ago, was John Lewis, who still bears battle scars from being hit over the head with a billy club. This conversation and this work, I think, is incredibly important. And I'm heading to Selma, Alabama, once I leave here, to really honor the legacy and work of those who came before us. We stand on the shoulder of giants. The battle around the right to vote has been long and protracted, but we shouldn't give up.